Thank you, Pastor Vicky, for that powerful and poignant prayer. It reminds us that when we say Happy Mother's Day, it's complex. It carries all of the blessing and challenge that Pastor Vicky led us through in prayer. We don't know what mother means to each of us, but for each of us, it carries weight, it carries emotions, it carries gratitude, and for many of us in some places, it carries that challenge and that strain as well. It's such a complex thing to be a mother. In mid-February, I woke up in the middle of the night. I had just had a dream about Pat Newell, who was my elementary school music teacher, and I don't normally dream about my elementary school music teacher, and so I thought maybe this is from God. Perhaps I'm supposed to reach out to her. I grabbed my cell phone and I looked up her name and saw that she had died in the same month, and I thought, oh, maybe I'm supposed to go to her funeral. And then I looked closer. It was like 3 or 4 in the morning, and I realized, no, she died a year ago, in February 2019. And I went on to read her obituary and learned that there were things about Miss Newell that I never knew. I knew that she had taught me songs that I imagine even if someday you find me in a retirement center and I can't remember your name, or that I was ever at Trinity Baptist Church, I imagine I might still be able to sing to you, "Here we go with the test they call toss. Some say kids can't possibly pass, but all of us know our plan can help each student pass tests. We've got a grand plan. What a grand plan. Knowledge shared, be prepared. That's our grand plan, and we will think our problems through, write our stories through, read with care and with skill. Yes, we'll pass that test, you betcha we. Yes, we'll pass that test, you betcha we will. Yes, we will." She didn't write that music, as you probably know, but she did write those words when it was announced, this was many, many decades ago, they don't even call it the toss any longer, that there was going to be a new standardized test, and children and parents and educators alike wondered, what is it going to mean to have this test, and how are our students going to do? And Miss Newell would not allow us to be discouraged. She would not allow us to remain worried and anxious, and so she wrote that song and taught us to sing it so that as we went into that test, though our knees might be shaking, though we might be anxious about how we would do, we could remember those words and sing them and be encouraged. I doubt I'll ever forget that song. But there were many other things I learned about Miss Newell that I never knew as I read her obituary. She never actually gave birth to children from her own womb, though she raised 3 children that her husband had from a previous marriage. And in her obituary, it also said that she is survived by the thousands of children she taught music to from 1961 to 1995, and I am blessed to count myself among the many children whom she mothered. She worked in the music department at Grace United Methodist in Austin, Texas, and she was a volunteer for the United Nations. The one other thing I will remember about Miss Newell, besides the fact that I think much of my love for music stems from her, is that once in a while, just every so once in a while, we as a class might get just, shall we say, a little bit more than unruly. And though Miss Newell was a beautiful person of faith, she wouldn't try to blur the lines between church and state. But sometimes when she was at her last end, she would say, and I've not seen Poltergeist or The Exorcist, but it seemed to me like something that might be out of it, because all of a sudden she would look to the skies and just say, "Help me, Jesus!" And we all, just like the hair on the back of your neck, stood up. You knew she wasn't blaspheming. She wasn't taking the Lord's name in vain. She was crying out for help, and we knew we better shape up right away because Miss Newell was calling on the Lord to give her help and strength. I imagine there have been many mothers in this season that find themselves in a similar place, calling on God for strength and help during this time. We see in our text in Matthew chapter 15 that there is this so-called Canaanite woman who is calling out to the Lord. I say so-called because it's an anachronistic term. You know, if you are good students of your Old Testament, that the Hebrew people went into Canaan, into the Promised Land over 1,000 years ago, and they conquered Canaan. There was no longer any such place called Canaan. There hadn't been Canaanites for many, many years. And Matthew's no academic slouch. He knows that, and yet he's chosen to use this peculiar term to name her by, this Canaanite woman. We'll continue to look at that. And in our passage, we read, leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly. She's crying out to Jesus, much in a way that reminds me of how Miss Newell would occasionally cry out when we were unruly. But Jesus has for me what is a very peculiar response. The scripture goes on to say, Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him. The disciples are at their wits' end. This woman is apparently crying out to the Lord, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus is just stone-faced, not paying attention to her cries. And so I was like, Jesus, we don't have noise-canceling headphones. Those won't be invented for like 2,000 years. Can you please do something about this, Jesus? And he says, they say, send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. And Jesus answered to them, not to the woman, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. He is clarifying his mission. He's saying, don't forget our redemptive history. God chose Abraham and his family so that they might know God's love and hope and truth, and that they might be transformed so they could be a light to the nations. I am here to be the fulfillment of that for the Hebrew people so that then they can go to the nations. But my mission, Jesus was saying to his disciples, is for Israel. When I was in kindergarten, I took not the TOS test, but another placement test that would decide whether I would be in the advanced math and language arts classes or in, I guess, the more remedial math and language arts classes. And my mother, herself a high school chemistry teacher, saw my scores, and she's not a woman to mince words. She said, son, a rock could have done better than you did on those test scores. But because of that, they had placed me in first grade in the lowest level of classes that I could have for those. And my mother went before the administration at Travis Heights Elementary School. Some of you are seeing perhaps a picture of us. This was from last year, Mother's Day at this time. And my mother went before them and she said, my son needs to have the same opportunities. I know that he is more than what this score says. And initially they said, no, we go by the scores. We can't show partial treatment. But my mother kept crying out to them and demanding that they give me a chance. And so finally they relented and said, well, we won't put him in both of the advanced courses, but we'll let him try the advanced mathematics class for 6 weeks. Boys and girls, I'm going to tell you, we had just barely started in my class learning like simple addition. And I get to this advanced class and they're already doing complex subtraction. I felt way in over my head. It was tough. I was drowning for a while, but my mother kept championing me, encouraging me, don't give up on yourself. You can do this. You can catch up. And I did. And I owe much of the man who I am today, much of the academic accomplishments that I have achieved to Maria Alicia Orozco Mack. And Mom, I love you, and I thank God for you and the gift that you have been in my life. My mother would not give up on me, and the Canaanite mother did not give up on Jesus or on her daughter. So now, though Jesus has ignored her, the passage goes on, the woman came and knelt before him and says, Lord, help me. He does now finally reply to her. It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. This is a really crummy answer by Jesus. That was meant to be a pun, crumb bread. Anyhow, Thank you. I have one laugh here. I'm assuming many more at home where you all are. Jesus looks at her and he uses what at best could be a term that, if it wasn't meant to be insulting, was not a very nice term. It is true that the Hebrew people thought of themselves as God's chosen people, the ones who could be at the table, and they thought of everyone else, you and me, all the Gentiles, often as dogs. Sometimes in disparaging ways, sometimes in less disparaging ways, but let's be honest, nobody wants to be called a dog. One commentator has wondered if perhaps the woman was trying to pretend as if she was Jewish. She did in fact say at the beginning, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me." She seems to know something about the Hebrew Bible and the God of the Hebrews, and perhaps Jesus is trying to draw out her authenticity and say, don't pretend to be something other than you are. You can come to me as you are. I see through this act and this facade. I see that you are a Gentile, not a Jew, and perhaps he uses this language to challenge her, to get her to confess and own who she is. We're not sure what it is, and I'm going to leave us to hang in the tension of this moment for a second, because I believe the woman did know something of the Hebrew Bible and of the Hebrew God, and Matthew reminds us of what the Messiah, Jesus, God's servant, was supposed to be in Matthew chapter 15. We're going to look very quickly at 6 signs of God's servant. Matthew 12, starting at verse 17, says, "This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations." The first thing I see here is that we are called to claim our chosenness. If we want to be God's servant, if we want to walk in the footsteps of the true Israel, then we are to claim our chosenness. How do you savor and express God's purpose for your life and your world? You have to know that God has said from the cross that I say yes to you. I choose you despite your brokenness, despite your sin, despite your hang-ups, despite the pain and woundedness that you may have experienced or expressed into other people's lives. God says yes to us. I choose you. I want you from the cross. And we are to claim that chosenness, to know that God has said, I have a purpose for your life. Second, we are to soar in the Spirit. How does God's Spirit sustain and empower you in adversity? How is that wind, that breath of God, the Spirit, the air that fills your cell and propels you forward on those days when you feel like you can't go any further, when you are at your wits' end? How do you rely on God's Spirit to be the centering, sustaining, and propelling force of your life? Third, we are to join in justice. You know, we either join in justice, one word, if we are silent and don't speak out and work for justice, or we can join in space justice. We can join in the justice that God wants to bring to the world. How can you amplify God's redemptive justice for the downtrodden? Today is Mother's Day, and 26 years ago on Mother's Day, Wanda Cooper Jones welcomed her son, Ahmaud Arbery, into the world. His actual birth date would have been this past Friday. Many of you, if you've been reading the news or on social media, have probably seen lots of different hashtags and expressions of concern about the tragic and unjust way that his life came to an end. He was murdered, and it was in cold blood. He was unarmed, and our nation grieves and has spoken out against that injustice, and that is rightly so. But we are called, if we are going to join in God's justice, to not just speak up when it's popular, not just when it's trending, not just to be there for the hashtags. The race for justice is not a sprint, but a marathon. And we are called to join in God's good work so that future mothers don't have to face the same kind of bigotry and heartbreak and systemic evil that Wanda Cooper Jones has experienced. The passage goes on to talk about 3 other signs of a servant. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out till he has brought justice through to victory. We see that God's servant moves in meekness. It's this ability to be around the vulnerable and the weak and not to have to overpower, not to have to be pushy. We sometimes think the one with the most power is the one that can really demonstrate it and show it, but true power is able to be among the weak and vulnerable in caring and compassionate and creative reworking ways to not only champion them, but to make of this old world a new world. We are to heal the hobbled. How can you bring God's healing to those others take advantage of? And we are to rescue the riffraff. That's not a word we use too often, but it is a word that would have described the way the Hebrews were tempted to look at the nations, at the Gentiles. Oh, they're the riffraff. They're the ragamuffins. They're the outcasts. They're the people that we don't want to have anything to do with. And Isaiah, and Matthew reminds us of this passage in Isaiah, reminds us that this is actually the hallmark of what it means to be God's servant. So perhaps this Canaanite woman, knowing all of these 6 signs of God's servant, is still going to hang in the game. And so we go back to our original passage, and she now replies to the Lord, "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted," and her daughter was healed at that moment. You see, a mothering hope doesn't just move mountains. A mothering hope builds bridges. How can we build bridges in our world when it comes to injustice? 2 books I would suggest to you if you're struggling, if what happened to Ahmaud Arbery seems to you to be something shocking and surprising, because I'll say it was not shocking or surprising to me that he was gunned down. It was not shocking or surprising to me that justice was delayed for 2 months. It was, if anything, shocking that finally 2 months later, justice seems to finally be moving into action. If you find yourself wondering, how can I be a part of God's answer to this broken world when it comes to racial injustice? I would suggest starting with these 2 books, Be the Bridge by Latasha Morrison and The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. They are not the word of God, but these are 2 African Americans who love the Lord with all their heart, and they have done the work to write some incredible pieces that not only help us to understand this justice issue in a broader perspective, but to know how we can join in it. We have been trying to do this here at Trinity Baptist. You may remember that in January, we had a Can We Talk About It event through our Micah 6:8. And there, Randy Butler talked about the ladder of indifference. He said the higher up we get on that ladder, the easier it is for us to not hear the cries of people, to demean them, to dehumanize them, to see them as people who we are only arguing against to try to prove our superiority. But when we take steps of humility off of that ladder of indifference, we are able to join in the conversation, to build the bridges that Jesus wants so that we can be an extension of God's healing to the world. Where does Mother's Day find you? Perhaps you're realizing the pain, the woundedness, the way you've hurt others or have been hurt by them, and you're wanting to experience the fresh forgiveness that Jesus Christ offers. He lived and died and has risen from the grave so that all sin and injustice in this world can be overcome. If you want to join his movement, if you want to know that you're forgiven, if you want to be a part of his peacemaking, justice-bringing movement, then all you have to do is say yes to Jesus. Ask him to forgive you, to cover over your sin, to make of your old life a new life, that you want him to be the leader in the remodeling and renewing project of your life and of this whole world. And if you pray to Jesus saying, I need you, forgive me, be the leader of my life. His Spirit comes into you to sustain you, to save you, and to send you forth into the renewal of the world. Perhaps you're finding that you've done that, but Mother's Day still brings challenge and hurt for you. Wherever you are at home, we all have a mother, whether that's a relationship of blessing and a relationship of challenge. I want you to spend a few moments just talking with God during this response song about what it means for you on this Mother's Day to follow in the way of Jesus.